Welcome to the Global News Podcast from the BBC. I'm Valerie Sanderson and I'm joined by Daniel Bush, who is in Washington. Daniel, today we're talking about a Senate primary vote in Texas, which was won by the candidate backed by President Trump against the incumbent Republican. What does that tell us about the grip that Donald Trump has on the Republican Party?
Well, Valerie, that's the key question here is how much influence does President Trump still have over the Republican Party now in his second term? And the answer is quite clearly a lot, right? We saw President Trump jump into this runoff race a week before voting to endorse Ken Paxton, a controversial figure in Texas, a core Trump supporter, not a member of the Republican establishment any longer, against a very emblematic member of that same establishment, John Cornyn, who is a trusted lieutenant of Mitch McConnell, of course, the long-running former majority Republican leader of the Senate. So Cornyn sort of represented that establishment, more moderate Republican wing that had controlled the party for decades before Trump's rise to power. When President Trump made this endorsement, he said what he typically says, and in these situations that Ken Paxton, was a loyal supporter, that John Cornyn did not stand with Trump, when it counted most. That kind of thing. In the past, he's called John Cornyn a rhino, a Republican in name only. So, it's not that Trump is deeply committed to Ken Paxton himself. But, in Paxton, Trump sees someone who he knows, will vote with him, will support his agenda, will not be critical of him. And it's not just Paxton, and we can talk about other Republicans this cycle. But, anytime a Republican comes out publicly and criticizes Trump, Trump often will hit back. And the most powerful way he can hit back is by finding a primary opponent to support and to try and remove that Republican from office. And in Texas, he was successful.
And it's not just Texas, as you implied there. I mean, other candidates endorsed by President Trump, I'm thinking about Louisiana and Kentucky, they've won too, haven't they?
That's right. And in Kentucky, that's another prominent example where Thomas Massie is a House Republican who has been increasingly critical of Trump. Importantly, Massie was the Republican who co-authored legislation that forced the Department of Justice to release files related to Jeffrey Epstein. So he has been a thorn in Trump's side for a while. And unlike in Texas, where Trump jumped in at the last minute to endorse the MAGA candidate, in Kentucky, he's been openly critical of Massie now for months. And he saw that as another opportunity to send a message to the party not to publicly criticize President Trump. And I can tell you, Valerie, that, in conversations that I've had with Republicans, this is top of mind to them. They know that, if they publicly even so much as whisper that they disagree with Trump's policies, with his rhetoric, they know that this White House is watching all of those comments very closely, that, that could invite a Truth Social post, minutes, hours, days later, that it could invite a primary challenge. So Republicans are very, very wary of speaking out against Donald Trump.
And yet, President Trump's approval ratings, Daniel, are at some of the lowest in years, certainly since he came back to the White House for a second term. So how do you square that circle?
Well, that's the thing that's sort of difficult, I think, for most people to understand. It's how is it that Trump could, on the one hand, have such low approval ratings, on the other hand, have such a vice grip on the Republican Party? And I think that the best way to explain this is to dig into those polls, very quickly, and just to point out that, yes, his overall approval rating is now under 40%. 37, 36%. That is very low. That is a worrisome sign for Republicans in November. But, that also reflects, a lot of displeasure with him among independents, among Democrats. If you look at the Republican Party, his approval ratings are still, in any given poll, 70%, 80%, sometimes even higher. So the vast majority of Republicans remain, with President Trump. That's good for him personally. It's bad for the party in November, where they're expected to perhaps lose control of both chambers of Congress. It could be problematic for whoever runs to replace Trump in 2 years. But for Trump himself personally, his political brand, his identity, that is still something that is deeply popular among the Republican Party faithful. And for that reason, he still has a lot of influence over the Republican Party.
And do you think he would be sanguine about losing centrist voters?
What Trump cares about first and foremost is Donald Trump, his legacy, his role in the world, his influence over the country, and so on. And so, if he were running for reelection, which constitutionally he's not allowed to do, then he would be more focused, I think, on those centrist voters, those independents. Can he do anything to keep enough of them in the fold to secure another White House term? Because that's not first and foremost for him. It's less of an issue. And we see that play out, for example, with Iran, where polling shows us, over and over again that the American public, including independents, including even some Republicans, are not happy with this war. Trump sees that as a core part of his legacy, and he's willing to continue this conflict, even if he may lose voters at home. So I think that we'll see that over the next couple of years. President Trump will be making decisions that will be less focused on the electorate itself and more focused on sort of his own issues, securing his legacy. So the short answer is no. I don't think that for him and for his White House team, those voters who might have mattered in the past are quite as front and center for him now.
I mean, we've been talking for 10 years, haven't we, about the Republican Party becoming the party of Donald Trump. Do you think President Trump himself sees this as a work in progress? I mean, he's not done yet.
That's a very good question. Presidents have always tried to influence and shape their party in their image, right? That itself isn't new. But in the past, it's played out more privately. It's the president and his political team at the White House and outside allies maneuvering, behind closed doors, handpicking which candidates they want, which candidates, they don't want, not putting their fingerprints on it, because of course, if you publicly back someone and they lose, then the president looks bad. Trump has really changed that playbook by doing everything out in the open. So he is, on social media, in public comments, always talking about Republicans that he likes, that he doesn't like, endorsing a lot of people, more endorsements than is typical for a sitting president. And yeah, I mean, at this point, if you look at the makeup of Congress on the Republican side, there are vanishingly few, so-called moderate Republicans who are willing to stand up to him, only a couple in the Senate and a couple in the House. And if we look ahead for a moment to 2028, which will be here before we know it, in the end of Trump's term, past presidents have followed a particular sort of framework for their post presidencies where they step out of the limelight, they give the person replacing them, time and space to come up with their own policies, form their own government, and so on. And Trump is not doing that. Trump, most likely after 2028 will continue to endorse people, will continue to hold rallies and so on. So we can expect, this isn't a finished deal. This is, as you said, a work in progress, and he will probably continue to try and shape the party going forward.
And do you think he has changed the Republican Party forever, even when he's not there, even when he's not president?
Forever is a big word. I think that the pendulum swings back and forth in American politics. And if you look at history, certainly sort of the modern period, post World War II, both parties tend to swing back and forth, and the swings typically take a couple of decades. So a party will be sort of refashioned in the image of FDR, and then that period lasted for 30 years from the Great Depression, and then the party started changing in the 1960s. Or Ronald Reagan remade the Republican Party in the 70s, and to a certain extent it's still the party of Reagan, but that lasted a couple of decades, and then Trump remade it. So it's undeniable that his influence, on the Republican Party and on American politics is deep and it's lasting. History suggests that a decade from now or 2 decades from now, someone else will come along, another sort of transformational figure who will redirect the party in another direction. I think that's inevitable, but certainly for the next years to come, if not decades, his presence will be felt.
And what about his successor? Doesn't an awful lot depend on that person and who Donald Trump decides to back?
That's right. And that, I think, it's an important point, because that will help shape his legacy, right? President Trump needs a Republican to win the 2028 election, because if a Democrat wins, then we'll see what happened with Joe Biden happen again, where the Democrat will come into office and literally on day one, take out the pen and sign a multitude of executive orders rolling back Trump's trade agenda, his immigration policies, because the vast majority of what Trump has done in his second term has been by executive orders, not been legislatively, which means that a future president can undo it. So, for Trump's policies to live on into the near future, and for his sway over the party to continue, it's vital for him to have someone in office, who at a minimum is a Republican who will back most of his agenda, and in an ideal situation for President Trump, someone who supports all of his agenda. Whether that's J.D. Vance, the vice president, who has clearly tied himself very close to the president, or a Marco Rubio, who in the past was an opponent of his, but has moved, shifted to become a more loyal lieutenant. Trump needs someone like that. Of course, we have to note that Trump has talked about running for a third term. He says it's a joke, it's unlawful. But assuming he doesn't actually try and do that, then he'll have to pick someone else to carry his legacy forward.
Thanks, Daniel. That was Daniel Bush. And if you want to hear more on this story, listen to the Global News Podcast. Just click on the link below. But that's it from the Global News Podcast here on YouTube. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.